A millionaire found two homeless children one rainy night and decided to take them into his home. When they arrived, the older child looked around the house and suddenly said something to the millionaire that made his eyes widen. The city stretched beneath him like a mechanical beast, 1,000 lights blinking in the ink-black night, but Christian felt nothing as he stared out from his glass-walled office. His penthouse sat high above the world, detached from the hum of traffic, the blur of life below. The whiskey in his hand had long since gone warm. The ice melted into amber pools. He hadn't taken a sip. The clock on the wall read 1:42 a.m. But time meant little these days. His phone lay silent, its notifications long disabled. He had stopped waiting for calls that would never come. Work was all that remained, endless contracts, meetings that bled into each other. It was easier this way. Carlos had been right about one thing. As long as he stayed busy, he didn't have to think. His half-brother had suggested a new investment deal earlier that evening, some overseas expansion that promised astronomical returns. Carlos had been animated, flashing his usual easy grin, his fingers dancing over figures as he talked. Christian had nodded at the right moments and signed the necessary papers. It didn't matter. Success had lost its taste a long time ago. He turned away from the window, his gaze drifting over the office. Everything was sterile, perfectly arranged. Leather-bound books stacked neatly, a dark mahogany desk without a single stray paper. The only outlier sat in the corner, a framed wedding photo of a man who no longer existed. Christian forced himself to look at it. Melissa stood beside him in the picture, her dress a whisper of ivory, her smile as effortless as sunlight through glass. He remembered the moment the shutter clicked, the way she had squeezed his hand, laughing because the photographer had made them redo the pose 3 times. She had leaned in and whispered, "If they don't capture us right, we'll just grow old and take a better one." They never had the chance. The memory cut through him like a dull knife, slow and unforgiving. His chest tightened, but the ache was familiar, a wound he had long since stopped treating. His fingers clenched into a fist before he turned away, shoving the frame face down on the shelf. The letter had arrived 2 years ago. It had been left on the kitchen counter, next to a cup of untouched coffee that had gone cold. The words had been brief and clinical. Melissa had fallen in love with someone else, had chosen to leave, and would never return to New York. No explanation, no closure, just silence. For months, he had searched for reasons, for a missing piece that would make it make sense. There was none. She had simply walked out, and that had been the end of it. A bitter chuckle escaped him as he sat down at his desk, rubbing his temple. Love was a liability. That was the only thing he had learned. It made a man reckless, weak, dependent on things that could be ripped away without warning. So he had done the only thing that made sense. He let himself become something else. Christian buried himself in work in the cold, efficient world of boardrooms and profit margins. It had been easy. Numbers never lied. They never left. They never wrote letters. His employees feared him and respected him in the same breath. Deals were closed with precise ruthlessness. Empires expanded without hesitation. His name carried weight. His presence silenced rooms. But the truth was simpler than the world saw. He had simply become a man with nothing left to lose. A distant sound, the click of the elevator doors opening, broke the quiet. Footsteps followed, unhurried but deliberate. Christian didn't turn. He already knew who it was. "Carlos, you still here?" His brother's voice carried a lazy amusement as he strolled into the office, sleeves rolled up, his watch glinting under the dim light. "Even I clock out before 2 in the morning." Christian didn't look up. "Some of us work." Carlos laughed, dropping into the chair across from him. "And some of us know when to enjoy the fruits of our labor." He leaned back, arms resting behind his head. "Seriously, Christian, when was the last time you did something that didn't involve a contract?" Christian ignored him, reaching for a document instead. Carlos exhaled, shaking his head. You can't keep going like this. At some point you have to move on. Move on? The phrase was almost laughable. Christian finally looked up, meeting his brother's gaze. I already did. Carlos studied him for a moment, something unreadable passing through his expression before he shrugged. Sure, keep telling yourself that. He didn't push further. He never did. Carlos stood, stretching. Well, I'm heading out. Don't stay too late, unless you plan on finally marrying your spreadsheets. Christian didn't reply, and his brother took the hint, walking away. The elevator doors closed behind him, leaving Christian alone once more. The silence settled again, stretching between the walls, pressing against his chest. His gaze drifted to the drawer on his right. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, almost reluctantly, he pulled it open. Inside, beneath a few legal documents, lay a small black box. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands before snapping it open. The wedding ring gleamed in the low light, untouched, unchanged. His fingers hovered over it before, with slow precision, he closed the box and locked it away. A decision. A burial. Another night without ghosts. But ghosts never stayed buried for long. The rain had been relentless all evening, hammering against the pavement in thick sheets, turning the city into a blur of neon reflections and shifting shadows. Christian barely noticed the downpour as he sat in the back of his sleek black sedan, fingers tapping lightly against the leather armrest. Another late night, another deal signed, another day spent drowning in numbers. Ben, his long-time driver, cleared his throat. Should be home in 10, sir. The storm's slowing traffic. Christian barely nodded. It didn't matter. He wasn't in a hurry. They were stopped at a red light when he first saw her. A small, wiry figure crouched under the awning of a shuttered shop, arms wrapped tightly around a bundle of fabric. The rain had soaked her through, her hair tangled and dark, stuck to her face, and her too-thin jacket clung to her frame like a second skin. For a moment, Christian thought she was alone. Then he saw the tiny hand peeking out from the bundle. A baby. His chest tightened, an old instinct kicking in before logic could smother it. Stop the car. Ben's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, brows knitting in confusion. Sir? Pull over. Ben hesitated only a second before easing the car toward the curb. Christian was already reaching for the door handle. Outside, the wind bit into him immediately, cold and sharp. The rain soaked through his expensive suit in seconds, but his focus remained locked on the girl. She had stiffened the moment he approached, her grip on the baby tightening. Wide, sharp eyes studied him with pure suspicion, her small body tense, ready to bolt. She was afraid. Of him. Christian slowed his steps, keeping his posture non-threatening, but there was no mistaking the raw distrust on her face. She had learned too young not to trust kindness. You shouldn't be out here, he said, his voice low but firm. Not in this weather. The girl didn't respond. The baby stirred, letting out a soft, muffled whimper, and she instantly rocked him closer, shielding him as if Christian were a threat. He exhaled, adjusting his approach. What's your name? Still, silence. Christian wasn't used to being ignored. In his world, people answered when he spoke. But this girl wasn't a business deal. She was a child standing in the freezing rain, shielding another child with every ounce of will she had left. I can take you somewhere warm, he tried again. Somewhere safe. At that, her head jerked up, defiance flashing in her eyes. Nowhere is safe. The words hit harder than he expected. Better than this, he countered. She hesitated, but the baby let out a small, pained cry, shifting in discomfort. Her grip faltered, her lips pressing together as she stared at the infant. He was too young, too fragile, too cold. Not for herself, Christian realized. She wasn't hesitating because of fear for herself. She was deciding for him. A battle played out in her expression, pride and survival warring with desperation. Finally, she exhaled, long and slow. A decision. She nodded. Just once. Christian didn't waste time. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the car. "Come on." She moved stiffly, her body still coiled with tension, but she followed. As she passed him, he caught a glimpse of her trembling fingers gripping the soaked fabric wrapped around the baby. Ben, still wide-eyed with confusion, opened the back door. The girl climbed in carefully, shifting to the farthest corner, positioning herself between Christian and the baby as a silent barrier. Christian followed her, closing the door to ward off the storm. The car was warm, too warm compared to the outside, and he saw the girl physically flinch at the sudden change. Ben hesitated before putting the car back in motion. "Sir, drive," Christian said shortly. The tension within the car felt alive. Nancy, he didn't know her name yet, but somehow the girl no longer seemed fitting, kept her back pressed against the door, her arms curled protectively around the sleeping baby. The little one, now that he was inside, stirred only slightly before settling deeper into sleep. The drive was silent. Christian found himself studying them in the dim light. Despite her small stature, the girl exuded an unwavering determination in her posture and her refusal to retreat from his stare. She was exhausted, though. He could see it in the slight sway of her frame, the way her eyelids drooped before snapping back open. She was fighting sleep like a soldier on a battlefield. "He's sick," Christian finally said, breaking the silence. She flinched, as if expecting an accusation. "He's fine. He's cold," Christian corrected, "and underfed." Her jaw clenched, defensive, protective. Christian didn't push. Instead, he leaned back, pressing his fingers against his temple. Why did he even stop? He hadn't thought. That alone disturbed him. Ben glanced at him through the mirror, clearly waiting for some kind of explanation. Christian ignored him. Instead, he turned back to the girl. "How long have you been taking care of him?" Her fingers tensed around the baby, eyes flicking toward the window, as if searching for an escape route. Finally, she murmured, "Since the beginning." Something about the way she said it made Christian pause. The beginning. Like there was no world before the boy in her arms. Like he was the only thing keeping her here. Christian looked at her again, at the way she curled around the baby like a shield, and something unsettlingly familiar stirred inside him. The rain blurred against the windows as the city lights flickered past. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who the baby was. But he was starting to think this storm hadn't brought them into his path by accident. The storm followed them home, the rain lashing against the windows of Christian's penthouse as if demanding entry. The city lights flickered through the glass walls, illuminating the sleek, modern interior, everything sharp, clean, untouched. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of polished wood and old books. Nancy stood just inside the doorway, her small frame rigid, soaked clothes clinging to her. Her eyes darted across the space, taking in the unnatural perfection of it all. The cold luxury, the silence, the absence of life. She didn't trust it. Christian shrugged off his wet jacket, tossing it onto a chair. He turned to find her still standing there, unmoving, clutching the baby against her chest. "You can come in," he said, watching her reaction. She didn't answer, but after a few seconds, she took a cautious step forward, then another. Noah stirred in her arms, a soft whimper escaping his tiny lips. Christian exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. He had no experience with children, no experience with anything remotely close to this, but even he could see that the baby needed warmth. "There's a bathroom down the hall," he said. "You can clean up." Nancy hesitated. "Hot water," Christian added. "Towels. You don't have to stay." He wasn't sure why he said that last part. Maybe to give her an out. Maybe to convince himself that he wasn't making some irreversible mistake by bringing them here. Nancy's grip on Noah tightened, but she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Okay. Her voice was rough, unused to softness. Christian led her down the hallway. She took in every detail, eyes scanning the space with quiet suspicion. She was assessing exits, calculating escape routes. Smart kid. When they reached the guest bathroom, he stopped at the door. "Take your time," he said. "There are clean clothes inside. They'll be too big, but they're dry." Nancy's gaze flicked to him, wary but considering. Then she stepped inside and closed the door. Christian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned back toward the living room, rubbing his temple. Ben had been watching the exchange from a distance, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this?" Ben asked, finally breaking the silence. "No." Ben huffed a quiet laugh, but it wasn't mocking. "You want me to stay?" Christian shook his head. "Go home." Ben hesitated for a beat before nodding. "All right, call if you need anything." The front door clicked shut behind him. Christian poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in his glass. He sat down on the couch, his head resting against the backrest. What the hell was he doing? For years, his life had been meticulously controlled. Every action is calculated, every move is deliberate. And now, this, two strangers in his home, a girl who looked like she'd clawed her way through hell, and a baby who shouldn't have been out in that storm. The faint sound of running water filled the silence. He let himself close his eyes for just a moment. Then, soft footsteps. When he opened them again, Nancy was standing a few feet away, dry now, but still looking like she didn't belong. His old sweatshirt swallowed her frame, the sleeves rolled up clumsily at her wrists. Noah was wrapped in a warm blanket, resting quietly in her arms. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Instead, she glanced around the room, eyes locking onto something. Christian followed her gaze. The wedding photo. He had forgotten about it, the framed memory that had long since faded into the background of his life. Melissa, smiling, his hand in hers. A moment frozen in time. Nancy's entire body tensed. Her breath hitched. And then, before Christian could ask what was wrong, "I've seen her before." The words came out sharp, almost urgent. Christian sat up, his glass forgotten. "What?" Nancy's throat worked as she swallowed. "The woman in the picture," she said, voice lower now. "I've seen her before." Christian stared at her. A cold weight settled in his chest, heavy and unmoving. It wasn't possible. Melissa was gone. She had left, disappeared, chosen someone else. His mind raced, grappling with the impossibility of it. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell the girl she was mistaken, but there was something in the way she said it. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, conviction. Christian's fingers curled against his knee. "Where?" Nancy shifted Noah slightly, adjusting his weight before she spoke. She was pregnant. Christian stopped breathing. Nancy's voice was quieter now, but steady. "She was hurt. Really bad. My grandma, Deborah, found her, tried to help." The room felt smaller. The air is heavier. "She died after giving birth," Nancy finished. "Noah, he's hers." Christian couldn't move, couldn't speak. The world tilted. Melissa had been pregnant, and she had died. And then, Nancy reached into the pocket of the oversized sweatshirt, her small fingers wrapping around something. Slowly, carefully, she pulled it out. A worn-out silver ring, its edges smoothed from time, its surface dulled by age and wear. She stepped forward and placed it on the table between them. Christian knew that ring before he even looked. It was the other half of the pair he had locked away in a drawer 2 years ago. The engraving on the inside was unmistakable. C and M. Christian exhaled sharply, as if the air had been punched from his lungs. Nothing made sense. Everything made sense. Melissa had never left. She had never betrayed him. She had been out there, alone, dying, while he had sat here, convinced she had abandoned him. And now, this girl, this baby, the last pieces of her. Nancy finally met his gaze, and for the first time, her expression wasn't guarded. "She told my grandma a name," she said quietly, "before she died." Christian couldn't bring himself to ask. Nancy held his stare. "She said to take the baby. To Chris. I'm not sure." Silence fell between them. A storm outside. A storm inside. And somewhere in the center of it, the ghosts of what was lost. The ring sat between them, small yet heavy, a relic of a past Christian had convinced himself was buried. The dim lighting of the penthouse did little to soften the dull silver, its edges worn, its engraving faint but unmistakable. C&M, Melissa's ring. Christian's fingers hovered over it, but he didn't pick it up. He couldn't. Nancy, now dry but still looking as if she didn't belong in a place so pristine, stood in silence, watching him. Noah slept in her arms, his tiny hand curled against her chest. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nancy cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. I forget tell you my name," she said hesitantly. "It's Nancy." Christian barely registered it. His mind was too full, too loud. The rain against the window, the ticking of the clock, the unsteady beat of his own heart. Melissa. Pregnant. Alone. Dying. She had never left him. The weight of it pressed against his ribs, suffocating in its intensity. He had spent 2 years cursing her name, drowning himself in work, letting bitterness rot away at whatever parts of him had once been capable of love. And all this time, she had been out there, fighting for her life, trying to bring his child into the world. A child who had ended up in the arms of a girl with tired eyes and sharp instincts. A child who had nearly died on the streets before fate had forced Christian to stop his car that night. His head throbbed. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice lower than before. Nancy hesitated, glancing down at Noah before adjusting the blanket around him. When she finally spoke, her voice had the steady cadence of someone who had told this story too many times, but never to someone who truly mattered. "My grandma found her one night. She was bad off, bruised, sick. She barely made it to our doorstep." Nancy's jaw tensed, and for the first time, Christian noticed the flicker of something in her expression, not just wariness, but anger. She was scared, real scared, but she never talked about what happened to her. Grandma tried to ask, but she just shook her head. She only cared about the baby. Christian closed his eyes briefly, his fingers pressing against his temple. Melissa, always stubborn, always protecting others before herself. Nancy continued, her voice quieter now. "She barely made it through the birth. Grandma helped her, did everything she could. But after Noah was born, she got worse." Christian exhaled slowly, dread curling around his spine. He knew where this was going, but he didn't stop her. "She had a ring on," Nancy murmured, glancing down at the worn silver band on the table. "She held onto it the whole time. Even when she could barely talk, she wouldn't let go of it. She said a name before she—" Nancy hesitated, her voice faltering slightly. "She said, Chris." Christian's breath became trapped in his throat. Chris. Melissa had tried. Even when her body had failed her, she had tried. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep his emotions locked down. Nancy swallowed hard. "She asked Grandma to take care of Noah. She didn't have anyone else, so we did." A pause. "And then Grandma died too." The weight of it all settled between them, thick and suffocating. Christian finally reached for the ring. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the small, familiar groove along the inside where Melissa had once traced absent-mindedly while talking to him in bed. Nancy shifted on her feet. "I wasn't going to come find you," she admitted, eyes flickering to the ring in his hand. "But when I saw that picture—" Christian lifted his gaze. "I didn't know if you were the Chris she meant," she said. "But I figured it had to be." "It was. Of course it was." His grip tightened around the ring, his knuckles whitening. Noah, her son. It was too much. Too many emotions layered on top of each other. Grief, regret, anger. Something dangerously close to hope. He looked at the baby now, really looked at him. The soft curve of his face, the unruly dark hair, the way his small fingers twitched in his sleep. And then, his eyes. Even closed, Christian could picture them perfectly. Melissa's eyes, his mother's eyes, his eyes. Something in his chest cracked, but he shoved it down before it could fully break him. He had spent 2 years in the dark, 2 years thinking Melissa had chosen someone else over him, and now he had the truth, or at least part of it. His voice, when he spoke again, was steadier than he felt. "I need a DNA test." Nancy frowned, shifting Noah slightly. "What?" "I need proof," Christian said, his fingers tightening around the ring. "If he's mine." Nancy's expression hardened, her arms curling protectively around the baby. "He's not a thing you can just—" Christian cut her off. "That's not what I meant." Nancy hesitated, watching him carefully. "I need to know the truth." A tense silence stretched between them before she finally gave a short, reluctant nod. Christian inhaled sharply. "And I need someone to look into this." Nancy's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Christian stood, rolling his shoulders, pushing down the storm inside him. "I need a private investigator." Because this didn't add up. Melissa had been hurt when she arrived at Deborah's doorstep, bruised, terrified, and Melissa was not the kind of woman to run. Something had happened to her, and Christian was going to find out exactly what. The chapter ended with him pulling out his phone and making a call. The past wasn't done with him yet, and for the first time in years, he wasn't going to run from it. The next morning, the storm had passed, but inside Christian's penthouse, the tension remained. He had barely slept. The events of the night before churned in his head like a slow, grinding machine. Melissa's death, Nancy's story, the DNA test he had scheduled for later that day. And Noah. Noah, who had spent the night curled against Nancy's chest, breathing softly, unaware of the world he had been born into. Christian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city awaken beneath him, bathed in soft morning light. Normally, this was when he would make calls, review stock reports, prepare for meetings. Instead, he was here, caught in an unfamiliar stillness, listening to the quiet sounds of someone else moving in his space. Nancy. She emerged from the guest room cautiously, the oversized sweatshirt swallowing her frame, her damp hair curling at the edges. Her arms cradled Noah, and for the first time, Christian noticed the way the baby's tiny fingers grasped at her shirt even in sleep, as if afraid to lose her. She stiffened when she saw him watching. "You slept?" he asked, not sure why he cared. Nancy hesitated, then shrugged. "A little." Christian gestured toward the dining table. "You should eat." She glanced at the untouched plate of toast and scrambled eggs, eyes flicking back to him with suspicion. She had been taught that nothing came without a price. "It's just food," Christian said, sensing her hesitation. Nancy didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she sat down, positioning Noah carefully in her lap. She picked up a slice of toast, but didn't take a bite right away. Her eyes stayed on him, watching, waiting. Christian sat across from her. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but filled with something unspoken. Finally, Nancy broke it. "What happens after the test?" Christian leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "Depends on the results." Nancy's grip on Noah tightened. "If he's yours," she said carefully, "are you going to take him?" Christian didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how to. If Noah was his, then legally, yes, he had every right. But Noah wasn't just a name on a birth certificate. He was Nancy's family, the only one she had left. Taking him away would be like ripping out the only stable piece of her world. "No," he finally said, surprising himself. "I don't plan on separating you." Nancy's face didn't change, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. She took a small bite of the toast, chewing slowly. Christian studied her, a girl who had learned how to survive in a world that didn't care if she did. She was thin, sharp, wary, but there was something in the way she looked at Noah, in the way she protected him, that Christian couldn't ignore. "You're a kid," he said after a moment. Nancy shot him a glare. "No kidding. You've been taking care of him on your own." She nodded, expression unreadable. "Grandma helped, but after she died, it was just me." Christian ran a hand through his hair. "How did you figure it out?" Nancy interrupted. "I didn't. I just did what I had to. No hesitation, no self-pity, just a simple, brutal truth." Christian exhaled. He had spent the last 2 years telling himself that he didn't care about anything but work, that emotions were distractions, that attachments were liabilities. But watching this girl, a child, take on responsibility most adults would crumble under, something in him shifted. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked, and the question wasn't just for her. Nancy frowned. "What do you mean?" Christian picked up his coffee, staring into the dark liquid. "Before all of this, before Noah, before your grandmother died." Nancy didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I don't have the luxury of looking back." Christian considered that. He had spent 2 years doing nothing but looking back, at Melissa, at the letter, at the life he had lost. But now, his past wasn't just a memory. It was alive, sitting across from him, wrapped in a blanket and cradled in small arms. His past had Melissa's eyes. His past was breathing, and he wasn't sure what to do with that. The memory came uninvited, sharp and vivid. A warm summer afternoon, Melissa laughing beside him, fingers laced through his as they walked through the park. They had talked about children that day. She had teased him, saying he was too serious to be a father. He had rolled his eyes, telling her she was wrong. "I'd be great at it," he had said. Melissa had smirked. "You'd try to run your own kid like a corporation." Christian had pulled her close and kissed her temple. "Maybe. But you'd balance me out." She had smiled at that, and for a moment, everything had felt unbreakable. Then the memory shifted, turned sour. The note, the empty house, the silence. She had been alone. She had been pregnant, and he hadn't been there. Present, unspoken understanding. Christian's hand tightened around his coffee mug. Nancy had gone back to eating, though her eyes kept flicking to Noah, making sure he was okay. Christian set his cup down. "If the test confirms it," he said, voice measured, "if Noah is mine, I won't just take him. I'll make sure you're taken care of too." Nancy looked up at him sharply. "I don't need your help." "You do." Silence. Then she muttered, "I don't want charity." Christian shook his head. "This isn't charity." Nancy hesitated, then looked back down at Noah. For the first time since arriving, her defenses seemed to waver, just slightly. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But she didn't fight him on it either. And that was something. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the moment unfolding inside the penthouse. The bond was fragile, barely formed, but it was there. For the first time in a long time, Christian wasn't just thinking about himself. And whether she realized it or not, Nancy wasn't alone anymore. A week later, the envelope lay on his desk, untouched. Christian stared at it. his fingers drumming against the polished wood. The DNA results. Nancy sat on the opposite side of the office, her posture tense, her fingers curled around the armrest of the chair. Noah slept in the crook of her arm, unaware of the moment that would change everything. "Are you going to open it?" she asked. Christian exhaled slowly. Why was he hesitating? He had spent 2 years convinced Melissa had betrayed him, that she had walked away from their life without a second thought. Then Nancy had arrived, shattering the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Melissa had been pregnant. She had never left him. She had died alone, and her son had been raised by strangers. Is Noah his son, or is he the son of some strange lover out there of Melissa's, the one Melissa mentioned with love in that letter that year? He reached for the envelope, fingers steady despite the storm inside him. A sharp tear, a rustle of paper. His eyes skimmed over the neatly printed words, his breath catching at the result. Noah and Christian Grayson, 99.99% probability of paternity. Christian set the paper down with deliberate slowness. It was real. Noah was his. Something inside him cracked, though he wasn't sure if it was relief, grief, or something more terrifying, responsibility. Nancy was watching him carefully, searching his face for any reaction. When he finally looked up, her grip on Noah tightened. "So, is he—" Christian nodded once. Nancy swallowed, her eyes flickering down to the sleeping baby in her arms. "Guess that means you're his dad." The words settled heavily in the room. Christian leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. His dad. The phrase felt foreign, yet something deep in his chest stirred at the thought. But before he could process it further, his phone rang. Carter. Christian picked up without hesitation. "Tell me what you found." There was silence on the other end, followed by a measured inhale. "You're going to want to sit down for this." Christian's fingers tightened around the phone. "Just say it." A pause. "Melissa never left you," Carter said. "She was taken." The words didn't sink in at first. Then the weight of them slammed into Christian like a freight train. "What?" Carter continued, his voice calm but firm. "While you were away on that business trip, Melissa found out she was pregnant. She wanted to tell you, but someone else found out first." Christian's grip on the phone was white-knuckled. "Who?" Another pause. Then, "Carlos." The name hit like a gunshot. Christian went utterly still. Across the room, Nancy watched him, brows furrowing in confusion. Carter kept going. "He set it up. He had her write that letter, forcing her to make it look like she was leaving you. He made sure she disappeared before you came back." Christian's pulse roared in his ears. The office, the city skyline beyond the glass, it all blurred. Carlos, his own brother. Betrayal tasted bitter in his throat. Why? The question came out hoarse, barely controlled. "Money," Carter said simply. "Power. If Melissa had your child, your assets, your entire estate, everything would be locked in a trust for them. Carlos wouldn't have a claim." Christian closed his eyes, inhaling sharply. Carter continued. "He thought if she was gone, if you believed she'd left, you'd move on. No kid, no heir. Eventually everything would be his to inherit." Rage burned through Christian's veins, hot and merciless. Carlos had done this. His brother, the man he had trusted more than anyone. His voice was dangerously low. Where was she? A safe house at first. He kept her hidden, kept her weak. But she escaped. Carter's voice tightened. That's when she ended up at Nancy's grandmother's house. She was already too sick, too weak by then. She must have known she didn't have much time left. Christian's head pounded. Melissa had fought. She had escaped. And he hadn't been there. Carlos had taken everything from him. His wife, his son, 2 years of their lives. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, his hands curled into fists. Carter's voice cut through the silence. "Christian, don't do anything reckless." Christian's jaw clenched. "Send me everything you have. I'll handle the rest." He ended the call. Nancy was staring at him, uneasy. "What's going on?" Christian turned to her, his expression unreadable. His voice came out cold, controlled. "I need you to stay here. Keep Noah safe." She frowned. "Why? What are you—" But Christian was already reaching for his coat and his car keys. He had a brother to deal with. Christian stood in his office, staring blankly at the skyline stretching beyond the glass. The city, usually his anchor, now felt distant, like an echo of a world that no longer belonged to him. Carlos, his half-brother. The weight of the revelation settled in his chest like lead. He replayed every conversation, every interaction with Carlos over the past 2 years, searching for the cracks that had been there all along. Had there been signs? Had Carlos always been this calculated, this ruthless? Christian had never questioned his loyalty. Carlos had been the one at his side after Melissa left, the one pouring drinks and urging him to move on. She wasn't worth it. You can't waste your life waiting for someone who walked away. It's time to focus on what matters. The words now dripped with venom. Carlos had stood next to him, feigning sympathy while knowing exactly what had happened. He had watched Christian unravel, let him drown in bitterness, let him turn into a hollow shell of the man he once was. And all the while, Melissa had been suffering. Christian clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. He had been played. He forced himself to think rationally. Revenge would come, but not yet. If Carlos suspected anything, he'd tighten his defenses. Christian had to be careful. When Carlos arrived at the office later that afternoon, he walked in with the same easy arrogance as always. "Look at you," Carlos mused, dropping into the chair across from Christian's desk. "You look like hell." Christian didn't react. He had spent the past 2 hours perfecting his mask, ensuring there was no trace of the rage simmering beneath his skin. "I haven't been sleeping well," he said simply. Carlos chuckled. "You work too much, brother." His gaze flicked toward the whiskey bottle on the shelf. "You need a drink. Unwind a little." Christian gave him a tired, forced smirk. "Maybe later." Carlos stretched, looking at him with mild amusement. "Ben told me you've got some kids staying at your place. That true?" Christian's grip on his pen tightened for a fraction of a second, small enough that Carlos didn't notice. "Yeah," he said smoothly. "Strange situation. Ran into them on the street." Carlos frowned slightly, as if trying to decide whether to push for more information. "And now you're taking in strays?" Christian shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "The girl reminds me of Melissa." It wasn't a lie, but it was a trap. He watched closely, looking for a reaction. For a split second, so fast that most would have missed it, Carlos tensed, a flicker of something in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced with a smirk. "Sentimental, aren't we?" Christian leaned back in his chair, forcing a slow exhale. "Maybe." Carlos studied him for another beat before standing. "Well, don't let it distract you. You know how easily people take advantage of kindness." Christian nodded, pretending to consider the advice. "I'll keep that in mind." As soon as Carlos walked out of the office, Christian's mask dropped. He had him. Carter's investigation deepens. Back at the penthouse, Nancy was starting to relax. Not fully, but enough that Christian noticed. She still kept her guard up, but her stance wasn't as defensive when he walked into the room. She still kept Noah close, but she no longer flinched when Christian reached for him. Christian had spent his entire life making deals, negotiating, winning. But this was different. This wasn't a contract. This was trust, and he wasn't sure how to earn it. The ringing of his phone cut through the moment. Carter. Christian stepped into his study, closing the door before answering. Tell me. I found something, Carter said, his voice edged with tension. Something worse than we thought. Christian's grip tightened on the phone. What is it? A heavy pause. It's about Deborah. Something cold slithered down Christian's spine. Carter sat across from Christian, his expression grim. The late-night meeting had been necessary. This wasn't something they could discuss over the phone. The study was dimly lit, the air thick with unspoken tension. Christian leaned forward, elbows resting on his desk, jaw clenched. Tell me everything. Carter exhaled, his fingers drumming lightly against the manila folder in front of him. Deborah didn't die from natural causes. Christian remained still, but the cold, creeping rage inside him sharpened. I need you to be clear. Carter slid a document toward him. Her official cause of death was listed as a stroke, but the medical records were altered. Christian's eyes flicked over the papers, doctored reports, discrepancies in timestamps, signatures that didn't match. Carter continued. She didn't just collapse. Carlos paid her a visit first. Christian's grip on the folder tightened. The morning before she died, Carlos went to her house. Nancy and Noah weren't home. They probably went out for a walk. Neighbors remember seeing him. He wasn't subtle. He offered her money to keep quiet about Melissa, about Noah. She refused. Christian exhaled slowly, his heart beat a dull roar in his ears. And then, Carter hesitated. They argued. Witnesses heard raised voices, then a loud thud. One neighbor said she saw Carlos leaving, not in a hurry, not panicked. Just leaving. Christian felt his stomach twist. He left her there? Carter nodded. She had a heart attack. If someone had called for help sooner, she might have survived. But Carlos didn't. He walked out, and by the time anyone found her, it was too late. Christian clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. Carlos had done more than destroy Melissa's life. He had taken another. His brother was a murderer. He forced himself to focus. And the hospital? Carter's expression darkened. Carlos paid them off to falsify her records, made it look like a natural stroke. No one questioned it. She was old and lived in a rough part of town. It was easy to cover up. Christian stared at the papers in front of him, but the words blurred. His mind was already racing ahead. Nancy. She believed her grandmother had died peacefully, that it had been fate. She had no idea that Carlos had stood in that room, watched as life drained from the one person who had protected her, and walked away. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. Nancy had already lost too much. She had spent her entire life fighting to survive. Christian wouldn't shatter what little peace she had left. His voice, when he spoke, was steel. Does she know? Carter shook his head. No one does, except us. Christian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had expected betrayal. But this was an entirely different experience. Carlos hadn't just stolen years from him. He had left a trail of destruction, a wake of grief and suffering, all because of money. Christian straightened. I want everything, every document, every witness statement. I want proof. Carter nodded, sliding another folder toward him. I already started. We're building a case, but we need to be smart. Carlos is careful, but he's not untouchable. Christian's fingers traced the edge of the folder, his mind already calculating his next steps. Carlos thought he had won, but Christian wasn't the same man he had been 2 years ago. This wasn't over. This was far from over. The air in the office was thick with tension. Christian stood near the window, his fingers curled into fists as he stared at the city below. His reflection in the glass was unfamiliar, his features hardened, his posture rigid with barely contained fury. He had spent days reviewing the evidence Carter had compiled, each piece fueling the storm inside him. Melissa, Deborah, 2 lives stolen. and the man responsible had been standing beside him all these years, pretending to be his brother. A voice broke his thoughts. "They're ready for him," Carter said from the doorway, his tone unreadable. Christian inhaled slowly, steadying himself before turning. "Bring him in." Carlos entered with his usual air of arrogance, a confident smirk playing on his lips as he stepped inside. He was dressed in one of his tailored suits, as if this were just another business meeting. He glanced at Carter before settling his gaze on Christian. "Well, this feels dramatic," Carlos mused, taking a seat across from Christian's desk. "Is this some intervention? Because if you're here to lecture me about those kids—" Christian cut him off, his voice low and lethal. "Melissa never left me." The words lingered in the atmosphere, akin to a dire warning. Carlos's expression didn't change immediately, but Christian caught the subtle flicker in his eyes. A fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but it was there. Christian pushed forward, his voice unwavering. "You made her write that letter." Carlos let out a scoff, but there was an edge to it. "Is that what this is about?" He leaned back in his chair, feigning nonchalance. "Come on, brother. You're still obsessing over her." Christian didn't blink. She was pregnant. Carlos's smirk faltered. Christian stepped around the desk, closing the space between them. "You knew she was pregnant, and instead of telling me, you locked her away." Carlos's jaw tensed, but he still forced a casual shrug. "She made her choice." "No," Christian snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "You forced her. You threatened her, lied to me, and when she escaped, she died." The silence in the room was suffocating. Carlos sighed, shaking his head. "You're being dramatic." Christian slammed a folder onto the desk. Pages of evidence spilled out. Bank transactions, falsified medical reports and witness statements. "You bribed the hospital to cover up Deborah's death." Carlos's smirk vanished. Christian took another step closer. "You let an old woman die because she wouldn't keep quiet. You knew she had no one to protect her, and you left her there alone." Carlos's expression twisted into something darker. He exhaled through his nose, his composure slipping for the first time. "You don't understand how things work, Christian." Christian's voice was dangerously calm. "Enlighten me." Carlos stood, his usual charm replaced with cold resentment. "You think life is fair. You think everything just falls into place because you deserve it." He emitted a bitter laugh. "You were always the golden boy, the one our father groomed for success, the real heir." Christian stared at him, the pieces falling into place. Carlos scoffed. "You had everything handed to you. Money, power, a perfect life. And then, Melissa, that would have sealed everything. A child, your precious heir." His lip curled. "You didn't even see it, did you? The way our father looked at you, the way he never looked at me." Christian's pulse pounded in his ears. Carlos's voice grew colder. "I was never going to be more than your shadow. The bastard son, the afterthought. You would have locked me out of everything, just like our father did." He shook his head. "So yeah, I made sure that didn't happen." Christian clenched his jaw, his nails biting into his palms. "You took everything from me." Carlos's expression hardened. "I did what I had to do." The admission hit like a gunshot. Christian's hands trembled, not with fear, but with rage so deep it burned through his veins. He took a slow step back, inhaling through his nose, controlling the primal urge to break Carlos apart with his bare hands. Instead, he straightened. "You're right," Christian said, his voice eerily quiet. "You did what you had to do." Carlos tilted his head, as if sensing something was off. Christian turned to Carter. "You have everything?" Carter nodded once. Carlos's smirk began to return. "So, what now, Christian? Are you going to write a dramatic speech? Threaten me?" He gestured around the office. You think anything you do will change what's already happened? Christian shook his head. No. Carlos raised a brow. Then what? A knock at the door. It swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Carlos stiffened. What the hell is this? Christian met his eyes. This is your last moment as a free man. Carlos let out a dry laugh. You think you can... Carlos Grayson, one of the officers interrupted, stepping forward. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and manslaughter. Carlos's smirk disappeared. Christian watched as the handcuffs snapped around Carlos's wrists, the reality of it all finally sinking in. Carlos turned back to him, his eyes now filled with something closer to desperation. You don't have to do this. Christian's voice was ice. Neither did you. Carlos's face twisted, but before he could speak, the officers pulled him away. The door shut behind them. Christian exhaled, slow and steady. He had waited 2 years for justice, and now, as the silence settled, he finally let himself feel it. Relief, but not peace. Not yet. The courtroom was quiet. Carlos had been convicted. Justice had been served. Yet Christian still felt the weight pressing against his chest, the heaviness of years lost and wounds too deep to fully heal. He stood outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees, warming the cool autumn air. A few feet away, Nancy sat on the stone steps. Noah nestled against her shoulder, his small fingers curled into the fabric of her jacket. She was watching the people pass by, her face unreadable. Christian approached slowly, sitting beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Is it over? Nancy asked at last, her voice quiet. Christian exhaled. Yeah. Nancy didn't react right away. She shifted Noah slightly, adjusting his blanket, her fingers moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent too long taking care of others. I don't feel any different, she admitted. Christian watched her, recognizing something familiar in the way she carried herself, a survivor's burden. It takes time, he said. Nancy nodded, but she didn't look convinced. A comfortable silence settled between them before Christian reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 documents. He placed them gently on her lap. She hesitated before picking them up. Her eyes scanned the first paper. Her fingers tightened slightly. Adoption papers, she murmured. Christian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I know you don't need anyone to take care of you, Nancy. You've been doing that for yourself for a long time. He paused. But you shouldn't have to anymore. Nancy's fingers brushed over the ink of her name, the legal proof that she was no longer alone. She didn't look at him, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself so tightly as if afraid to let go. You don't have to decide now, Christian said, but I want you to know, this isn't charity, this isn't pity. Nancy finally looked at him. Then what is it? Christian's voice was steady. It's family. Nancy swallowed hard, blinking a few times before nodding. She set the papers aside and picked up the second document. Her breath caught as she read the words, legal proof of paternity, Noah's birth certificate, and at the bottom, Christian's name. She turned to him, eyes searching. So, you're really... Christian gave a small nod. Yeah, he's mine. Nancy looked down at Noah, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the world around him. For a moment she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, carefully, she whispered, Good. A flicker of something warm passed through Christian's chest. He wasn't sure what it was. Relief, gratitude, something close to hope. But it settled deep inside him. Later that evening, they visited Melissa's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the wind carrying the crisp scent of autumn leaves. Christian stood in front of the marble stone, the weight of everything pressing against him. Nancy stood a few feet away, holding Noah, giving him space. Christian knelt, running his fingers over the engraved letters of her name. He placed a single white lily beside the stone. His throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he murmured. The words felt inadequate. They always would. He had failed her. He hadn't been there. He hadn't known. But he would make it right. He whispered, "I should have found you sooner. I should have known." The wind rustled through the trees, the branches swaying as if carrying unseen whispers. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then, with slow certainty, he spoke again. "I'll take care of him." His fingers curled slightly against the stone. "I'll take care of both of them." A promise. A vow. He wasn't the man he had been 2 years ago. He was no longer the shattered shell of a person who had been deceived and drowned in sorrow. He had a son. He had a daughter. And for the first time in a long time, Christian knew exactly who he was. He stood, stepping back. Nancy met his gaze, her expression solemn but understanding. "Ready?" she asked. Christian looked at the gravestone one last time before nodding. They turned together, walking toward the future, toward something neither of them had ever expected. A family. 1 year later. The city stirred awake with the rising sun, casting golden light over the streets of New York. The world had moved on, and so had they. Christian sat at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee as he read over a document. Across from him, Nancy slumped over a textbook, muttering something about history being useless. Noah, now a chubby and lively toddler, sat in his high chair, gleefully smashing cereal with his tiny fists. The house no longer felt cold, no longer felt empty. Nancy huffed and shut her book with a dramatic thud. What's the point of learning about the past if you can't change it? Christian glanced at her over the rim of his coffee mug. "So you don't repeat the same mistakes." Nancy rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance there. Yeah. Feels like a waste of time, though," he smirked. "I'll remind you of that when you ace your exam." She narrowed her eyes. "That's assuming I care about the grade." Christian arched a brow. "You do." Nancy grumbled something under her breath, then reached over to wipe Noah's messy face with a napkin. The baby giggled, grabbing at her fingers. "Papa!" Noah chirped, his voice full of unrestrained joy. Christian froze. Nancy did too, her eyes widening slightly as she looked at Christian. It wasn't the first time Noah had babbled his name, but this time it was different. This time there was intent. Recognition. Christian swallowed past the tightness in his throat. He had spent months trying to navigate fatherhood, learning how to soothe a crying baby at 2 a.m., how to fumble through making formula, and how to carry a child who clung to him with unwavering trust. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the way Noah looked at him, for the way the word "Papa" sounded so natural from his lips. Nancy smirked, clearly enjoying his stunned silence. "Well," she said, "I guess you're stuck with us now?" Christian let out a slow breath, then reached over and ruffled her hair. "I guess I am." Nancy wrinkled her nose, swatting his hand away. "Gross." Christian chuckled, shaking his head. The past year had been difficult, full of adjustments, full of unspoken grief, full of learning how to exist as a family. But somewhere along the way, it had stopped feeling temporary. This was their life now. Nancy was doing well in school. She had made friends, something Christian never thought she'd be able to do after years of surviving on the streets. She still had her walls, but they were no longer as high, no longer as unbreakable. Noah had grown into a healthy, energetic child who followed Christian around the house, babbling nonsense, tugging at his sleeves and demanding to be picked up. And Christian? For the first time in a long time, he wasn't drowning in his past. The grief was still there, but it no longer consumed him. Melissa's memory wasn't just a wound anymore. It was a part of him, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of what had been saved. Some secrets, though, remained buried. Nancy still didn't know the truth about Deborah's death. Christian had made a choice to protect her from it. She had already lost too much and had already endured too many betrayals. The truth would come one day, when she was ready, but not yet. He would shoulder that burden for her. For now, she was just a kid, and he would let her be one. A silent promise. That evening, the three of them walked through the streets of the city. The air was crisp, the last remnants of winter fading into spring. Noah was bundled in his stroller, eyes wide as he took in the bright lights and movement around him. Nancy walked beside Christian, hands in her pockets, her posture relaxed. Then, without a word, she reached out. For a second, Christian thought she was reaching for something else, a distraction, a piece of lint on his coat, anything but what she actually meant to do. But then her fingers brushed his, hesitant, testing. Christian didn't hesitate. He took her hand. It was small but strong, a survivor's hand. Nancy didn't look at him, didn't say anything. But she didn't let go either. And Christian understood. It wasn't just a handhold, it was trust. It was a silent promise that no matter what had come before, no matter what still lingered in the shadows of their past, they were a family now, and he would protect them, always. As they walked, the first rays of sunrise began breaking over the skyline, painting the city in hues of gold and pink. A new dawn, a new beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.